Good afternoon, all of you know, I'm Ms. Fow, Director of Labor at Wayne, and I want to welcome you to today's Fraser Center lecture entitled Sedition in the Hand of Fraternity, Industrial Workers, Radical Unions, and the Long Shadows of a Forgotten Red Scare. It will be given by the internationally known legal and labor scholar, Professor Ahmed White. Dr. White is the James E. Jones Jr. Professor of Law at the University of Wisconsin. A graduate of Southern University and Yale Law School. He also served during his time at Yale as essays editor for volumes of the Yale Law Journal. After graduation, he served as a researcher with the program in Civil Liability. Subsequently, Dr. White worked for the Louisiana Senate and as a visiting assistant professor at Northwestern University. In 2000, he joined the faculty at the University of Colorado Law School, where he was later named Nicholas Rosenbaum Professor of Law. For much of his career, White's scholarship has focused on the history of law and labor relations in the early to mid-20th century and on the viability of a functional system of labor rights in our society. He is one of the country's leading experts on the history of labor repression, which is a major subject of his two acclaimed books, The Last Great Strike, Little Steel, CIO, and the Struggle for Labor Rights in New Deal America, and more recently, Under the Iron Heel, the Wobblies and the Capitalist War on Radical Workers. Under the Heel was a recipient both of the International Labor History Association's Book of the Year Award and Princeton University's Richard A. Lester Prize for Outstanding Book of the Year in 2022. A prolific scholar, Ahmed White has written articles for the Berkeley Journal of Employment and Labor Law, Wisconsin Law Review, Buffalo Law Review, and others, and given interviews with Jacobin, whatever, current and the Valley Labor Report. He is currently working on two new labor projects, which we talked about one of them over lunch, but also another one that has come up. One about radical farmers in the 30s, another about coal mining and labor struggles in the 20s and early 30s. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ahmed.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Jamie, all of you involved in bringing me out here. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm going to talk with you today about this other project and this alluded to. And I'll start with a story that's relatively familiar. So as darkness fell on the evening of Tuesday, May 4th, 1886, a bustling crowd of several thousand gathered in Chicago. They assembled there to protest the events of the previous afternoon when police shot dead several workers in a flash a few miles away at the city's McCormick Rebuilders. That crowd was never as large as organizers had expected, and by 10:20 or so was beginning to dissipate. By that time, most of the speakers had spoken. The mayor who had come by had gone home, and it had just begun. And it was then that the better part of some 200 police marching with their sidearms drawn pushed their way to the speaker's stage, which had been set up on wagon. The police commander, William Ward, read the riot act, ordered the crowd to disperse. When the speaker, Samuel Fielding, protested, Ward repeated the command. Just as Fielding conceded, a sizzling, sparkling object arced over the crowd and detonated when it hit the ground, filling the air with shards of metal and wood, bathing the area in yellow-orange light, then producing a deafening blast. A dynamite bomb had been lobbed toward its formation a few yards from the stage. Almost before it went off, the police opened fire. Muzzle flashes from their revolvers, creating orbs of light. Darkness. A few demonstrators may have returned fire, but most were unarmed, half blinded, nearly deaf, and they ran for their lives. And the sound of the screams and the guns gradually diminished, and sort of peace returned. Blood was everywhere, along with injured and dead people. 7 police and at least 4 demonstrators had been killed or mortally wounded. Over 100 people had been injured, around 2 dozen of them quite severely. Within hours, the police commenced a roundup of radicals and especially anarchists. They organized a great number of violent, warrantless raids all over Chicago and imposed a kind of martial law. Within days, the police had detained a large pool of suspects and were actively hunting for others. A month after the bombing, Cook County prosecutors announced that 10 men had been indicted for the death of a policeman named Matthias Deegan, the only policeman killed by a bomb as opposed to gunfire. 2 months later, 8 defendants were convicted of Deegan's murder, and on November 11, 1887, 4 of these men, having disdained the idea of gubernatorial clemency, were led to the gallows at the Cook County Jail, seeing a Marcellian statement to the deaths. So this again represents the principal events of the Haymarket affair, named after the square where the trouble occurred. Despite the trial and extraordinary succession of newspapers, magazine stories, books, scholarly articles, all other kinds of inquiry, what happened remains uncertain even today, with doubts about the defendant's guilt, accompanying lingering questions about the facts and the way these men were convicted. Anarchists, including some of the defendants, were then connected with bombs, and several defendants had published inflammatory statements, some promoting bombs. But only 2 of the defendants were present when the bomb detonated, and it's clear that neither had lobbed the device. As prosecutors in the case admitted, whatever culpability rested on the defendants had to have been based on the charge they had, by means of conspiratorial conduct, abetted the acts that caused Deegan's death. Inevitably, this manner of establishing guilt was controversial, not least because if the case was framed in this way, guilt would have to hinge on inherently contentious accounts of what the defendants had communicated, or relationships to each other, and on the nature of anarchism, a philosophy that not all the defendants clearly held and that did not always endorse the early bombs anyway. From the outset, the uncertainty surrounding the case was shaped by the same turbulent currents of conflict that had given rise to this episode in the first place. The trouble at the McCormick Works had grown out of a coordinated nationwide strike, a great upheaval, long in the planning, backed by anarchists, among others, and centered on industrial workers. Poverty, of course, was widespread in the industrial working class, but the strikes, which began May 1, were not only or even primarily aimed at that problem. Rather, they were intended to normalize an 8-hour workday at a time when 10 and 12-hour days were common, and many people worked 7 days a week. They were also intended to redress the extraordinary, oppressive, dangerous, and alienating conditions that typified work in industrial America. And most of all, to renew lives that had been robbed of dignity by industrial capitalism. In this context, it was inevitable that many people in labor and leftist circles would believe the bombings at the Haymarket had been a provocation. And to see in the killings, in the trial, and the executions, ample proof that the state and the legal system were servants of the capitalist class, whose representatives had conspired among themselves to uphold a system of inhumane exploitation, as violent in its conception. But for these capitalists, for most politicians and newspapermen who took an interest in the matter, and probably for a majority of the country's growing professional and commercial middle class, the events surrounding the Haymarket had a different implication. The great upheaval might not have been an immediate portent of revolution, but this program of protest and the events of the Haymarket on May 4 were alarming indications of the many dangers afoot. Chronicling executions were fitting responses to something much worse than murder. One person who tended to see things in these terms, albeit in the service of a moderate purpose, was William Salter, Harvard-educated ethicist, who had published widely, lectured at a number of universities, and emerged as a co-founder of the NAACP. In October 1887, as the defendant's appointment with the hangman approached, Salter delivered a lecture before the Society for Ethical Culture in Chicago, the city's grand office. It was widely reported in newspapers and later reprinted and circulated. It was titled, "What Shall Be Done with the Anarchists?" According to Salter, a careful reconsideration of the case would make clear that 3 of the defendants should never have been convicted of murder, under any circumstances. Such was their distance from the killers in place and time, and the lack of proof that they had planned to cause trouble. In making these points, Salter set forth what had already become an enduring framework for debating the outcome of the case, one that focused on the course of the trial, with doctrines of conspiracy and complicity were applied. His lecture was a further inspiration to more debate of that kind, as he soon jousted in the newspapers with those who questioned his conclusions. But Salter also made another observation in his talk, a broader one whose relevance extends beyond questions about the fates of these defendants. In the course of raising doubts about the trial, Salter ruefully insisted that the men were actually guilty of another crime, one for which they had not specifically been tried, but that was, as crimes go, infinitely greater, he said, than murder. They had made it their aim, he said, to put down in this country all laws and all force that protect what is ordinarily known as private property. And they had not limited themselves to promoting this program and the doctrines that comprise it in a civil and academic way, as by a public lecture, but instead had, in covert and temperate fashion, quote, urged working men to organize on the basis of it. This is what made them guilty of the greater crime, which was sedition. It was Salter's claim that behind the state of Illinois' successful murder prosecution was a case actually premised on sedition. And he was not wrong. Prosecutors had built their case upon the close connection between several defendants in the radical workers' newspaper, Arbeiter Zeitung, as well as the anarchist publication, The Alarm, which were based in Chicago. And they implied throughout that the trial and the proceedings that followed, the defendant's culpability consisted of their use of these and other forums to incite the masses. The trial court's instructions to the jury aligned with this, and so did the decision of the Illinois Supreme Court, which made a special point of endorsing exactly this means of coming to a guilty verdict when it upheld the murder charges. In all these determinations, there is something frequently lost in ensuing debates about who did what concerning the Haymarket, not to mention broader discussions about sedition, about labor repression, and the law, nature of law in class society. The affair was seditious, and what made it seditious was not merely or even primarily the fact that by attacking the police, if that's what had occurred, the anarchists had attacked the constituted authority of the state. Rather, it was that the trouble was conceived as a broader assault upon the prevailing economic order, the kind of authority it presumed. Sedition is the crime of incitement against lawfully constituted authority. In its Anglo-American form, the doctrine emerged principally in the 16th century, in England, developed in concert with the modern state and around the idea that inchoate threats to the authority of the state, particularly by means of speech or writing, also by conspiracy, constituted a serious crime. Broader in reach than treason, from which it draws its essence, sedition was the most essential means, alongside lesser but still serious crimes like riot and vagrancy, of using criminal law to protect the integrity of the social order against systemic challenges. The 16th century was a residually feudalistic work in which political power tended to converge directly with economic power. In this world, when sedition protected the state's claim to political sovereignty, it more or less directly protected the sovereignty of economic elites, at least against any class but their own. By the 19th century, however, industrial capitalism was well along in displacing this old order, with a new one in which political and economic power reposed separately. Politically, in a state whose legitimacy rested on its legal independence from individuals and social classes, and economically in industrial capitalists themselves, who legally were distinct from the state, but wielded in their own realm an economic sovereignty no less significant than the political sovereignty. As Salter's reflections on the Haymarket made clear, this change in social structure made sedition an effective but awkward device for safeguarding the economic order, one that only availed itself by contrivance. But in the years that followed the Haymarket, the concept and the doctrine of sedition were reformed in frankly progressive ways, along with the legal order, such that sedition could be used explicitly to safeguard the power and interests of people who own lumber mills and coal mines from threats by the lower classes, and without the need to demonstrate any threat to the state or any overt violence. Among the precursors of this evolution in the meaning of sedition was the suppression of the levies in the early 19th century in England. One of the most revealing reflections on this appears in Charlotte Bronte's Victorian novel Shirley, A Tale, which features a striking description of a premeditated nighttime attack on a textile mill by a great crowd of armed men and boys. This episode, whose ferocity and destructiveness stand in contrast to the rather less exciting narrative that otherwise dominates the novel, famously draws on a very real event. The midnight assault on a mill in Yorkshire in April 1812 by as many as 200 workers. Although they were well armed, carefully organized, and determined to seize the factory, the establishment had been fortified and was defended by soldiers, and the attackers were repulsed at great cost to themselves. 2 of their number were killed that night. A year later, 5 were hanged, and several others transported to Australia in repayment for an undertaking that was treated as a constituted crime of sedition, in other words, treason. The attack on the mill was an important event in the episode known as the Luddite Uprising, which raged mainly in the 18 teens through the Luddite Triangle, encompassing Yorkshire and the north and northwest of England. These Luddites were mostly textile workers who perceived in the adoption of new industrial machinery a devastating program that, where it didn't simply throw them out of work, was destined to fundamentally degrade their working lives, divest them of autonomy and dignity, subordinate them to the governance of the new machines and the dictates of those who owned them and supervised their use, and in the balance lay waste to their communities. They therefore demanded that mill owners desist from adopting machinery and resorted to threats, overt violence, and machine breaking when their demands were not heeded. In Bronte's telling, endurance, overgoaded, stretched the hand of fraternity to sedition. For Bronte, who like many reformers then and now, sympathized with the workers' plight, but she did not sympathize with their methods or aims. It was exactly this overgoading that was most intolerable about such eruptions of unrest. If incitement of this sort was intolerable, it was also right to be repressed with relentless assiduity, which is how Bronte admiringly describes the mill owners' pursuit of the leaders of the riot. And if incitement was deserving of retribution, it was also fit to be preempted by repressive means. In this country, the early sedition laws were patterned, of course, after those in England, and they famously figured in early political conflicts between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. But they were also shaped by a recurrent need to suppress rebellious farmers and slaves, whose situation, particularly in the latter case, as far as sedition was concerned, was not entirely unlike that of feudal serfs or peasants. In the slaves' world, political and economic sovereignty remained convergent, a fact that rendered sedition laws redundant to the master's authority, and yet integral in dealing with larger uprisings which portended the overthrow of this whole system. This is why sedition, along with kindred insurrection laws, fairly proliferated in the South. In any case, the application of sedition to protect the sovereignty of industrial capitalists and the stretching of its meaning that was necessary to accomplish this purpose had to await the further development of industrial capitalism, which was only really coming into its own around the time of the Haymarket. The Haymarket affair was not the only occasion in the late 19th century in which the persecution of radicals was framed as an exercise, punishment or discouragement of something seditious. Indeed, in one way or another, this was characteristic of a great number of contentious labor disputes during this period, including some of the most familiar, the Great Uprising of 1877, the Homestead Affair, the Pullman Strike, the Western Mine Wars, and many others. Now, what made this kind of repression necessary, of course, was a tide of worker resistance, one that took shape around in opposition to industrial capitalism's transformation of life. Industrialization was indeed revolutionary in ways that were frequently devastating. Notwithstanding the great influence of Thompson, Getman, and Montgomery and others, too often historians and commentators deny it, or they focus on industrialization's immiserating effects, which were real enough, but often rebutted with contentions about falling prices and overall development. production. But what's less easy to refute in any case is the new sovereignty that the social order vested in the hands of capitalists. A new program of control instantiated in the factors, the supervisor, the foreman, proliferation of scientific methods and rules, the comprehensive tyranny of the clock, the speed-ups, the stretch-outs, and other means by which the machinery of industrial production, in every sense of that word, was used to intensify the pace of work and expand the reach of supervisory control. This was evident at the McCormick Reaper Works, where the trouble grew out of complaints about excessively long hours and low pay, as well as a new system of management instituted by the Ivy League educated son of the company's founder, Cyrus McCormick. A system that ruthlessly ferreted out inefficiencies in production, justified low wages and long hours. A program of supervision that made the factory like a penitentiary. It was no accident that resistance to this program was the concern of anarchists. As the history of anarchism makes clear, an important strain in its development and meaning was an uncompromising opposition to industrial capitalism. This is expressed in the works of Kropotkin and Bakunin and Tolstoy, the motivations of the Haymarket anarchists, and in the aspirations and deeds of prominent anarchists who came after them, including Alexander Berkman, and of course Emma Goldman, someone who, like many anarchists, found in such political activism both a response to and a refuge from industrial capitalism. What distinguished this kind of anarchism from its libertarian alternative is that its antipathy to the state rested upon an understanding of the state's complicity in the oppression of working people. And that what made the state so odious in this regard was the authority it wielded on behalf of a greater, more insidious and more dangerous sovereignty, the sovereignty of the industrial capitalists. It goes without saying that anarchism never emerged as an enduring anchor of protest against or resistance to this economic order, in part because of its own organizational incoherence, in part because it was so effectively suppressed. The suppression was abetted by the anarchist penchant for violence, not only surrounding the Haymarket itself, or the antics of Goldman and Berkman and Johann Most, which were at times infantile and immoral, but also the assassination of President William McKinley by Leon Showish, a man who was drawn to anarchism by the degrading experiences that marked his time working in the environment. Showish said that he shot McKinley to help working people. His actions were a landmark moment in his story, as they led directly to the enactment of the country's first criminal anarchy statute by New York State, where the assassination occurred. By making it a pride to advocate anarchism, belong to an anarchist organization, criminal anarchy codified anarchism as a kind of sedition. It made sedition less dependent on particularized threats to the state and more on defendants' ideological beliefs and associations, and it tied this all to a program of suppressing opposition to capitalism. Several other states, including my new home, Wisconsin, followed suit with their own criminal anarchy laws. This was all central to an anarchism scare marked by roundups, anarchist several-year lynchings, and the enactment of a federal law getting attention now, barring anarchists from entering the country. Criminal anarchy laws were clearly intended to rein in attacks on industrial capitalism as well as the state. They were progressivism's answer to the threats that radicals posed to capitalism as much as to presidents. In the years that followed, other repressive laws were adopted that fit with this logic. For instance, this period saw the enactment of the first black flag as well as red flag laws. But what was, I think, more significant in the years that followed McKinley's assassination, as far as our story is concerned, was the replacement of anarchism as the leading means of mounting a revolutionary challenge to the reign of industrial capitalism. This involved a turn toward unionism as such, and a further change in the way sedition was used on the labor front. Again, as the hand of fraternity stretched, so was the meaning of sedition. What I have in mind, of course, is the story of the industrial workers of the world, an organization I've written quite a bit about, and about which I imagine many of you know a great deal. You've likely heard of its principal leader, William Big Bill Hayward, who offers a ready example of the tough life experiences that inform the organization's purposes. Indentured as a child to work on a farm, he became a hard rock miner at age 15 and later worked as a cowboy before returning to the mines and then emerging as the IWW's foremost leader in its most crucial years. Always good for this sort of thing, Harry would famously quip that while he did not know much about Marxist capital, he had the marks of capital all over himself. I won't retell the IWW story except to emphasize a couple of things that I think are integral to the subject at hand. First of these has to do with the nature of the organization, which, like the anarchist movement of Luddites, for that matter, defies simple description. It's obvious that this union was about more than bread and butter matters. It was a revolutionary organization committed to overthrowing the system of wage labor. What's less obvious, though, is how deeply rooted this ambition was in a critical condemnation of the alienating and dehumanizing nature of work in industrial society. Perspective I would suggest owes as much to the IWW's anarchist antecedents as to its precursors in the socialist and trade union movements. To put this in terms I've used before, but with an emphasis that I have not yet taken, when the Wobblies, as they were called, spoke about being under the iron heel, they meant not only the extraordinary repression that they faced as members of the organization, but also the everyday hardships they endured as industrial workers. This orientation is readily evident in any number of facets of IWWism, in the Wobblies' famous refusal, within the throes of repression, to yield to capitalism's utilitarian logic of pain and reward, in their frequently expressed and sometimes avidly executed aspiration to escape beyond the frontiers of industrial society, as by setting up a farm, putting a small business, or embarking on a prospecting adventure, maybe to Mexico or the Klondike. And speaking of the Klondike, in the Wobblies embraced the politics and worldview of Jack London, whose violent, naturalistic, and masculine writings were, in their essence, a defiant and thrilling repudiation of industrial capitalism's suppressive and domesticating tendencies. Indeed, when the Wobblies invoked the idea of a workers' commonwealth as the ultimate aim of their struggles, they imagined not so much a future of leisure as is sometimes, I think, mistakenly attributed to them, but rather a kind of revolutionary transcendence of all the debilitating and degrading elements of work in the capitalist society. It's this, in fact, that not only helps put to rest the idea of the Wobblies as quixotic and crazy, it also reconciles what otherwise looms as an abiding contradiction in the Wobblies out, which was characterized by both a consuming anathema to work and its comprehensive veneration, by a hearkening to both a romantic past and a rational future. I think this kind of vision is also what distinguished the Wobblies' efforts from parallel attempts to defend workers' autonomy against the depredations of industrial capitalism by means of craft unionism. Kind of activism premised on job control, craft unionism was not nearly so inherently reactionary as it's sometimes imagined, but it nonetheless proved futile in a way that drove its adherents into the dubious redoubts of business and bread and butter unionism, craft parochialism, and social exclusion. This takes us to the second point about the Wobblies that I want to emphasize, which has to do with sabotage. The Wobblies were not Luddites, but they shared with the machine breakers a connection to this tactic. They were utterly committed to sabotage in a broad sense, basically a program of relentless striking, including, in this sense, on-the-job sit-downs, picky strikes, and slowdowns. This was absolutely integral to IWWism. But as scholars like Rebecca Lawson made clear, the union was also committed to what was called destructive sabotage, which was to say sabotage in the everyday sense of the word. With this embrace of sabotage, the Wobblies showed their understanding of something that Karl Marx comprehends and that the Luddites, who Marx did not quite understand, had come to see long before he was born, which is that the sovereignty of industrial capitalism was anchored in the functioning of its machinery, and that to disrupt this machinery, whether by striking or actual destruction, was to challenge the sovereignty of the capitalists. Moreover, the Wobblies perceived that to idle all the machines, which was their eventual plan, was to reclaim control of the whole social order. It's precisely, I think, because sabotage served this function, the Wobblies not only embraced it, but they embraced it in what otherwise seemed like an irrational and contradictory way. More in symbol and in practice, but also in a manner that celebrated the concept, even as doing so cost the organization any hope of legitimacy outside of the most radical settings. Sabotage was the IWW's millstone precisely because it was also the organization's lodestone. Just as lobbing bombs and assassinating politicians made it easy to condemn anarchism as seditious, so did sabotage make it easy to condemn IWW as seditious. Or rather, it made it easy to fold the union's defining activities into a definition of sedition that had already been modified with the criminal anarchy statutes. Beginning in 1916, the union made remarkable headway with workers on the brutal boundaries of industrial society. First in agriculture and lumber, then in construction, mining, oil, and on the docks. These accomplishments rested on the strength of a new organizing tactic that essentially made every member an organizer, as well as favorable wartime labor conditions. This success led directly to the IWW's version of industrial unionism being explicitly criminalized, made into the embodiment of sedition. And this was done by the enactment of criminal syndicalism laws, which made it a felony to advocate or belong to an organization that advocated industrial or political change by means of violence, sabotage, or other criminal conduct. And also made it explicitly criminal to challenge employers' control of the industrial process. These laws were enacted alongside a number of modernized but otherwise more conventional sedition laws, some of them geared to protecting the war effort, but most broad enough to criminalize industrial sedition, and some enacted with the IWW in mind. Nevertheless, the criminal syndicalism laws stand out. They represented the very essence of this equation of IWW-ism with sedition. They were enacted in some 20 states and a good number of cities, pretty much everywhere the union was particularly active. Between 1917 and 1925, 500 or 600 Wobblies were arrested on these charges, felony version anyway, mostly on the basis of mere membership. And several hundred were in prison for as long as 6 years. And it wasn't just criminal syndicalism laws that availed themselves for this purpose. Between 1918 and 1920, there were also 3 big prosecutions under provision of the 1917 Federal Espionage Act that was used to criminalize industrial unionism in its own way. As a result of these trials, about 160 of the union's members, including most of its leadership, were convicted and sent to prison. Although the Espionage Act cases were premised on false claims that the IWW was in league with the Kaiser and determined to undermine the war effort, in these cases, as well as in the criminal syndicalism case, the more basic impetus of the prosecution were assertions about the union's involvement in sabotage, true or false, destructive or otherwise. Such was also the case with 2 other kinds of repression that the IWW faced: arrest and prosecutions for vagrancy and vigilantism. These practices also operate as means of prosecuting industrial sedition, as the newspapers called it, meaning they assimilated affronts to the authority of the capitalists to control the work with affronts to the authority of the state and public order. Thousands upon thousands were beaten and jailed in this way, and a dozen or more were killed. Just as the Wobblies' raison d'etre went well beyond higher wages, so did the reasons behind this repression. This was clearly evident not only in the legislative history of the criminal syndicalism laws, for instance, but also in the doings of police, prosecutors, and judges who followed legislators in condemning the Wobblies as industrial seditionists, who wanted to displace the boss, to desist from honest work, to impede technological advances, to run things for themselves. Often this way of condemning the IWW expressed itself in a revealing distinction between legitimate unionism and illegitimate unionism. The notion here was clear: workers could organize, but they must accommodate themselves to the essential mandates of industrial capitalism, which included not only a deference to private property, but acquiescence to the employer's sovereignty. And with this, that of the foreman, the clock, the machine. Anything else would be, again, industrial sedition. This program of repression disrupted the union's functions, decapitated its leadership, deterred its members and potential members, drained its resources, distracted it from other efforts, discredited it, delegitimated it. In all these ways, It played an important role in destroying the IWW, which by 1925 was largely defunct. Even before this was accomplished, a similar program was taking shape in the repression of the IWW's successors on the labor unions affiliated with the Communist Party. Now, the repression of communism in this country is well known, and not so well known is how often this was rooted in labor and conflicts at the point of production. This was evident even early in the Communist Party's existence in 1919, 1920. When the weight of persecution fell disproportionately on communists who were associated with, connected to the IWW and the cause of radical industrial unionism. This is why so many of the early cases of communists being prosecuted for criminal syndicalism or sedition involved people associated with one of the two parties that in the early years comprised the movement, the Communist Labor Party, which had considerable ties to the IWW. This bias in the nature of repression was characteristic of the 250 or so prosecutions of communists on state criminal syndicalism and sedition charges that followed the infamous Palmer raids. One of these Communist Labor Party defendants, Anita Whitney, was prosecuted for IWWism in 1920, was the subject of a landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision, Whitney versus California. Validating dozens of other appellate cases that upheld this kind of prosecution, Whitney established a precedent that would stand until 1969. Now, following the August 1922 raid on the secret party meeting in Bridgman, Michigan, a couple hours west of here, criminal syndicalism charges figured in a bungled attempt to prosecute the whole movement's leadership. This anticipated the second Red Scare, when the seditiousness of communism, by then plausibly connected to the intrigues of the Soviet state, was again brought to bear on the organization's leadership. But what awaited in the interim was a different kind of persecution, much more resemblant of what was done to the Wobblies and the anarchists, in order to do with labor relations and threats to the state. This first occurred in Passaic, New Jersey in 1926 and 27 amid promising efforts by communists to organize textile workers, when organizers were charged there with sedition. Later in 1929, communist efforts to organize cotton mill workers in Gastonia, North Carolina, resulted in imprisonment of several organizers. They were convicted of murder, but in a proceeding that was not unlike the Haymarket case, and for that matter, some IWW trials, actually more of a sedition trial than a murder trial. In fact, in what can only be described as another largely forgotten Red Scare, hundreds of communists were arrested on criminal syndicalism or sedition charges in the late 20s and 30s. And most of them were connected in some way or another to the cause of industrial unionism. This unfolded during what communists call the third period of capitalist development, when the party established its own industrial unions. The most prominent of these were the National Textile Workers Union, which was active in Gastonia, and the National Miners Union, which operated in the coal fields. The greatest concentration of prosecutions of communists in this period was among people connected to the NMU, the National Miners Union, and not surprisingly, because by then, nowhere in industrial America were workers' struggles to defend how they lived and worked as significant as in coal. Well into the 1920s, coal miners enjoyed what Carter Goodrich called at the time the miners' freedom, a range of traditional prerogatives to work as they please, free of much supervision, bureaucratic controls, and the dictatorship of machines, and also to strike with extraordinary frequency. But that was threatened by new management strategies based on the expanded use of mining machinery and supported by the leadership of their union, the United Mine Workers, and its new leader, John L. Lewis. Resistance to this fundamentally progressive program, and that's how Lewis described it, underlay a raging insurgency within the UMW. One that took form first as the Save the Union movement and later evolved, at least in part, into the NMU, which was formed in late summer of 1928. Save the Union and NMU activists bore the brunt of a vicious campaign of persecution by local police, prosecutors, and vigilantes, often supported by UMWA leadership. Dozens were prosecuted for criminal syndicalism or sedition, as well as riot. Hundreds were assaulted and roughly a dozen were killed in episodes that we clearly justified in the language of sedition as means of protecting the social and economic order, not only from Bolshevism, but from people who were contemptuous of the need for discipline, hostile to the authority of the bosses, the union leadership, and the sanctity of the production process, as well as the machines around which this was all organized. Some prominent people were caught up in this campaign. In late 1931, two of the cultural figures who wrote most sympathetically about industrial workers, John Dos Passos and Theodore Dreiser, were indicted for criminal syndicalism in Bell County, Kentucky. The two had ventured there and into neighboring Harlan County to support the starving miners there, amid attempts by the NMU to resurrect a ragged strike in that district. And so they were threatened with imprisonment. However, most of those charged with industrial sedition of one sort or another were rank and file workers and everyday organizers. And unlike Dos Passos and Dreiser, they were not protected from prosecution by their faith. Now, I don't mean to suggest that because communist unionism was so thoroughly identified with viability, workers' struggles for control, that the communists themselves offered a viable alternative to the degradations of industrialization, or that the party was in some way fundamentally opposed to industrial society. Even as rank and file workers embraced communist unions because of their intimate grievances with the system, the parties remained committed to the notion that only by a dialectical process that would simultaneously embrace industrial capitalism and supposedly struggle against its exploitative and alienating features could it be, as it were, transcendent. Now, this was by its own terms a contradictory program, and nowhere was this contradiction on such tragic display as just a few miles from here in Dearborn in 1932. As many of you know, on a brutally cold day in early March of that year, Dearborn police and company operatives turned tear gas, fire hoses, and Tommy guns onto participants in a communist organized hunger march, a march for workers' rights, really, headed towards Ford's River Rouge complex, and killed 5 people. Several young people associated with the march were charged with violating Michigan's criminal syndicalism law. And yet Henry Ford mocked the marchers for attempting to protest at his plant while their people, meaning communist technicians from the Soviet Union, were there to study the company's production methods. In any event, this communist ultimate aim of revolution, like that of the anarchists and Wobblies, never had much of a chance. And their retreat on the labor front is likewise complicated development with many essential components, some of which are traceable to Stalinist machinations in Moscow and others to the rise of fascism. But a key part of this story is repression, in the name of suppressing sedition, which battered communist unionism in the fashion it had the Wobblies, and ultimately made their undertaking impossible, even as a means of shaping developments in the labor front. As these radicals themselves often understood, repression guaranteed the collapse of their program in the early 1930s. Now, this is not the end of our story. Successful repression of these challenges to industrial capitalism not only gave credence to the idea that any kind of radicalism of this sort was illegitimate and dangerous, it also lent legitimacy to an alternative kind of industrial unionism, an industrial unionism in the literal sense, a unionism at home in the world of industrial capitalism, a unionism whose job was to deliver the goods, meaning higher wages and benefits and such, but on the condition of adapting itself and its members' interests to the most essential mandates of industrial capitalism. And this is exactly what defined labor's moment of greatest triumph in the 1930s, when none other than John L. Lewis, the chief collaborator in the destruction of the miners' freedom, emerged as the main architect of a model of industrial unionism that would redefine the American labor movement. The center of this development was, of course, the Committee for Industrial Organization, or CIO, whose accomplishments I do not want to discount, but I also don't want to discount its limitations, which consisted of an unwillingness to challenge the capitalist's essential control of the production process, to effectively blunt the adoption of new technologies, to produce a culture of work that was fundamentally less alienating, to preserve a robust culture of striking, to preserve or to restore worker sovereignty in production. This orientation actually made the CIO's industrial unionism more appealing to many employers than the old craft unionism of the American Federation of Labor, which is a principal reason that the latter embraced its premises as well. It also goes a long way in explaining why, as Colin Gordon, among others, argues, it wasn't industrial unionism that New Deal employers feared and detested so much as the prospect that the kind of unionism manifested in IWWism, communist organizing, would somehow resurge. And it also defined as well the recurrent struggles for rank and file reform and union democracy in this period, into the post-war period, which from this vantage emerged not as quarrels about corruption or authoritarianism, but as largely unsuccessful attempts to restore to unionism a role in challenging the basic sovereignty of industrial capitalism at the point of production, and recapturing something of the older spirit of anarchism, IWWism, and even communist movements. Today, the representative realities of industrial capitalism extend beyond the factory system, the plot, or the foreman, to include ecological destruction, relentless surveillance, HR, the proliferation of bureaucratic rules, and of course, the sanctity of the machines, which are now supposed to possess an intelligence that rivals our own. These are the foundations, I'm certain, of a society in which millions of workers, their basic needs mostly sated, nonetheless live lives of loneliness, boredom, isolation, uncertainty, and malaise, not least within the workplace itself. The labor movement is not the direct cause of this grim reality, of course, but its failure to offer a plausible response makes it partly complicit in these conditions, while also undermining its relevance and therefore contributing to its chronic weakness. Which begs the question, is there a way forward? Back in 1984, Margaret Thatcher drafted a speech in which she described the striking coal miners in the United Kingdom as the enemy within. The only reason she didn't actually deliver the speech is that her plan to do so was undone by a bombing orchestrated by actual terrorists. When Thatcher what she proposed to say was shocking to someone it came to light a decade ago, so, but not to me, and not because I'm an expert on Thatcher, but rather because I know that this is how labor has long been seen in this country too, by people of both parties, and more than a few among them avowed liberals. Labor's accommodations notwithstanding, sedition is an albatross around the neck of the entire labor movement, even today. It's the anchor, conceptually, of a legal and political culture that treats even conventional unionism as presumptively criminal. For these conventional unionists, this is an outrageous blood libel comment. They are not the enemy within. They are not anarchist communists. Or maybe worst of all, IWWs, as I've heard so many union people insist to me, obviously trying to maintain their relevance. And that is where they err, I think, because rather than disowning this aged slander, they should maybe make themselves worthy of it, with an understanding that only in this way do they have any real hope of accomplishing something more important, which is to disclaim complicity in a crime infinitely greater than industrial sedition. In other words, what labor lacks is not so much the energy of the New Deal or the CIO or confidence of the post-war period, as many are inclined to say, but rather what defined this older radicalism. And what it needs is precisely what this radicalism offers. Of course, I don't mean bombings or assassinations, which I categorically oppose, or even machine breaking. Instead, what I have in mind is a deep skepticism, not only about the overall sanctity of capitalism, but also about technology, about progress, about progressivism. What labor needs is a vision unreconciled to the mandates of industrial capitalism, counter-revolutionary inclination as far as capitalism is concerned. And if this makes unionists and their champions seditionists, if it makes us the enemy within, then I say far better to stretch the hand of fraternity in this way than to remain collaborators in our own continued degradation. Thank you.
Just, thank you so much for that presentation. Really, I like the thread that you made, in particular, the Red Scare after World War I and the linkage between some of the early communist union efforts through the 20s then with IWWs. Although interestingly, as you probably know from Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's autobiography written later under the Stalinist cover, she denounces or essentially talks about the IWW as left-wing infantilism,
Yep.
or Leninist reference. So that kind of separation out, I'm wondering, first of all, what you might say about that, but secondly, one of the other things that's interesting is in the post-World War II period at the River Rouge plant, the local 600, there was an effort again, led by communists to a certain extent, to stop the decentralizing, as it was called, of labor, to protect the union by demanding 40 hours pay for 30 hours work. That radicalism at the Rouge plant, local 600, was then put under receivership by the UAW and Florida Reuther, sort of kowtowing to the HUAC line at that point. So I just wondered, there are these moments punctuated by revisioning of the past that I wonder if you could make some more comments.
I guess there's a broader answer to the question, and it kind of goes to the nature of my project as I understand it, which I guess in some ways can be described as trying to tease out of stories something meaningful that isn't dependent on the viability of what was being attempted. Or maybe that's indifferent to it. So Michael Cass, in his review of my book Nation, said that he said I was a wobbly, which I was honored to hear. But I'd rather be that than the kind of person who writes Nation. He also said that the problem with the Wild, in some ways it was a generous review, but he said in some ways the problem with the Wild was that they didn't know how to win. Yeah. And my response to him is they knew how to lose. And in a lot of ways, that's more important than winning at the cost of your integrity. And I think running through the best of communist unionism, the best of anarchism, about which I have great reservation, the best of IWWism, about which, as a notwithstanding, I also have some reservation, is this skepticism about what I think is a monstrosity that is destroying us all, a sort of Damocles, more than that, something we're already in, and that is industrial society. It is, in a kind of contradictory way that is nowhere better embodied than in Marxism, let alone communism. It's the world we have to live in, but look what it's doing to us. And what I perceive, and maybe this is my sort of personal motivation for this, as I get a little bit older and all that, what I perceive as a kind of acceleration of its degrading and destructive effects. It seems utterly out of control. And maybe that's what's, I don't know, a psychoanalytic way driving me to this, but what I'm trying to do is tease out of these different movements something meaningful, even if we can all agree, as I think we should, that there were serious shortcomings in what they were trying to do in the prospect of actual success, and also contradiction, as many other things we could say about what they did, especially the communists, what the anarchists would reveal. Oh, yes.
Thank you for riveting the accounts there. I really appreciated the careful attention and tracing of the legal, the way in which sedition has changed over time and place. And it's interesting, it starts in Europe, it comes to the US, and I'm wondering about how things played out in the US versus Europe as capitalism developed. And
that's a very good question, and I don't know yet. But I appreciate the question, and I appreciate the compliment that's in it, and what else you said, because, for me, this is a record. I've been writing about labor repression for 20-something years now, and yet I perceived in the last few years that there were things about this story, fundamental things that I didn't really understand, and maybe no one fully understood, that had to do with this thread of sedition, how it changed. And I'm not the first person to write about this. I mentioned, of course, E.P. Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm. This is very interesting work, and that whole crowd. They've done some interesting work on this, but most of that work is in England, and most of the work on sedition here is in connection with slavery and Reconstruction, or kind of the high politics of the Alien and Sedition Acts. Although that's an overgeneralization. It's an interesting social history, that too. But it does seem that when people, including myself, when we've written about criminal syndicalism and that kind of thing, we've forgotten that this is actually a sedition type law. And we were talking earlier, I think one reason for that is that we don't want to imagine that these organizations that most of us are inclined to defend really were seditious in one way or another, but sometimes to some extent in both ways. Like the story about sabotage. There's this whole current of IWW scholarship. It's they never did anything like that. That just never happened in the history of the world, and that's obviously not, that's not true. And things are a little bit different with sort of communist historiography, but that's, as many of us know, that's a thorny place to be, for a variety of other reasons. Oh, yes.
I love so much the themes you've drawn from the past till today. Some of the questions swirling around anarchism in our immigration laws, and also I think the question of how labor approaches AI is really pressing. But what actually, if you want to talk about that, I'd love to hear anything you have to say about the labor movement and AI. But what I wanted to ask, when I speak with unionists and radical activists and radical unionists, the one tactic that keeps coming up is the notion of a general strike, especially in current culture. And feels a little unrealistic, but maybe a little bit less so. I know the UAW is an interesting contract realignment strategy, which I've read some articles about in 2028. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts. There's some lessons from the past that we might think about today.
So suggestions I make, thank you for that question, and even the suggestions I make, I sometimes feel a bit of discomfort making, because I'm pleading for an audacity that is costly to people. As everything I've studied shows. My book, maybe the defining theme in my book on the IWW is to show how repression worked, and it worked by destroying people's lives. And that's not, that's not nothing. And obviously we see in the world today what can happen to you. You go to the wrong protest, and next thing you know, you're locked up. In my home state, Louisiana, and maybe on your way back to your own country, something like that. But I do think that it's time to think in audacious terms, because the stakes are so high. AI, I don't know a great deal about specific responses to it, but I do know that it is a threat. And I say this as someone who was deeply influenced in my early life by the early Marx. It's something that threatens to destroy the very thing that makes us most human. And that is our ability to recreate ourselves through labor. And I just find that absolutely terrifying. And I see what I perceive to be, although it's not something I'm studying in a serious way, but what I perceive to be the first manifestations of this, as I mentioned in the talk, the widespread proliferation of indolence and boredom, of addiction, of various kinds of unconstructed behaviors that I think are traceable exactly to this. And so, like a lot of people, I sort of meddle in this area. Sometimes people say, well, or you're a Luddite. That's exactly what I do. That is exactly what, aren't you? And it's not because I don't appreciate the value in industrial society. It's because I try to imagine transcends it. We've all benefited from the technologies themselves and the changes in social structure. But we're also, I think, paying an awful price. So I'm sorry that was kind of a rambling.
No, I need to ask the question.
Yes.
Well, like everyone, I appreciate it. I'm a political scientist and I study Latin America. So as you were speaking, and particularly toward the end about the construction of radicalism is dangerous, I was thinking about the intersection not only with the industrial structure, the economic structure, but the political structure. And I was wondering if you've given some thought to the intersection between the political structure and the party system, for example, and that successful construction of radicalism is dangerous. Because if you look at Latin America, they've got the presidential systems, but they got multi-party systems with certain sorts of rules, and with the multi-parties, the communist parties have survived in most countries, it maybe not thrived. I can't really say that more space for radicalism there created, a better opportunity for workers to assert or reassert their sovereignty. But I'm just curious as to whether you've thought a little bit about, the sort of intersection of political institutions.
Not as much as I should, frankly. I think that would probably add something. What I'm trying to do, but it's frankly it meant sort of painting with a fairly broad brush and looking more at political tendencies and not structures in parties. So an important part of my work has been to do with progressivism, and it's, one of a better word, complicity that's happening. But I think you're quite right that there's something more to say here about party structures in politics than these broad tendencies alone might say. So it's an area of regrettable ignorance, inattention on my.
Well, thank you. At any rate, it's given me good food for thought. It's a thing I will continue to think about. The type of conversation has been coming up in different spaces for me recently. And, in terms of Michael's question about the intersection of AI and the response, I was with a group of students yesterday with an outside speaker, and they were just talking about whether one can kind of escape this trap of being, stuck in that social media world. And, someone was proposing that it takes enormous willpower, and someone else was proposing, well, it doesn't necessarily take enormous willpower to be a Luddite, like to make that choice or to just sort of find yourself by disconnecting some. So at any rate, lots of intersections with things I would think about. I really appreciate.
Thank you.
One more quick question, thinking about your call for being radical, or good walking more on that edge. But the dangers that also come with that, I'm wondering if you come across examples of movements that withdraw their labor. I know that may start moving towards sabotage because you can. But more recently, we've seen some of these kinds of movement in China. They have lay down and pull out, lay down, or there's the going to work but just not doing anything, or these kinds of withdrawing your labor, thinking about Marx, the most powerful thing you can do.
Yeah, that's a kind of thing that could resurge without a more immediate risk of criminal prosecution anymore. And it would, in a lot of ways, replicate what the IWW did. They did a lot less machine breaking than they did soldiering on the job and slowdowns, that kind of thing. And for the moment, although our present moment shows us how contingent bedrock constitutional doctrine can be, for the moment, the case that overturned Whitney versus California, which had basically validated all of this stuff. A case called Brandenburg versus Ohio, the 1969 case, is still good law. And to be very difficult, consistent with Brandenburg, to start locking people up just because they are part of a group that is committed to like slowing down on the job or engaging in sort of some kind of soft Luddism of that sort. On the other hand, again, as we know, Brandenburg might be living on borrowed time. It could well be that. And interestingly, things may have changed frankly, since Trump got elected, but until that happened, it was as easy to find enemies of Brandenburg among liberals as it was among conservatives. Because they were saying, oh, we need, to empower the state to deal with the Proud Boys or whoever, abortion opponents or that kind of thing. I think a lot of those people have probably changed it too in the last 3 months or so. But what you mentioned it is quite interesting, and it may be the most viable way of people finding a means of protesting. I don't know.
I think I've been thinking, so it's, this is quite muddled and circular thought, but sedition is about loyalty, about who you owe your allegiance to, who you are supposed to honor with, to respect their authority, etc. And each of the incidents that you talk about are points in which in American society, there developed an alternative view of this. Not all of it associated with the deep left, but people who thought about how you might have allegiance to a constitution, to a democratic ideal, to the rule of law, but you wouldn't necessarily have allegiance to a business owner, a property owner. And in each of those points in the 1880s, around the turn of the century, in the 19-teens, and later in the 20s and 30s, you have this vision that emerges that sort of separates out, I think what tend to be a unified vision of the state that you were owed allegiance to is rooted in public property. And that there's a separation out of those two things and an understanding that economic activity doesn't require that kind of obedience to an employer. And I just wonder if there's a logic behind those kind of waves of appreciation and awareness that links these things together.
That's a really interesting question, and I don't have an easy answer to it, although the first thing that comes to mind in further complicating the story is how that all interacts with the emergent doctrine of employment at will and the kind of erosion of the old master-servant relationship. And so you have this sort of residuum of an expectation of loyalty, but in a purely contractual, not in the state, to simplify, it's not in the status. I don't know what to make of that. All I know is I think that's quite interesting. No too is something. I think loyalty is part of this. And then of course it resurfaces, as we know in labor law, in these doctrines in the 1950s that emerged in the 1950s of the duty of loyalty. So, how can you violate or how can you lose your protections under the National Labor Relations Act? By being disloyal. Not by setting the building on fire or something like that, but by the key case, disparaging the employer's product while you're out on strike. That's disloyal. That's a case called the Jefferson Pilot. And you lose your protection. The employer will fire you, and it doesn't matter that you're striking or doing whatever. That's too bad for you. So I think that's very interesting. I think that's something I very much need to recognize.
So I've been a little hesitant to ask this because I couldn't come at the start of your talk. So forgive me if it's ground you covered, but I'm so struck by this. I think I hadn't really appreciated these laws as sedition laws. And I'm so struck by the kind of clarity of the vision that for one not to be obedient to one's boss, right, to the capitalist system is to be disloyal to the nation. And I just keep thinking about all these recent activists who are bound up in the kind of crosshairs of our criminal and immigration system, and how they're really being charged with against disloyalty is the theme, right? And they're, at least from the interactions I've been able to have, they're really perplexed and shocked by that characterization. They neither intend to be disloyal, nor do they expect to be viewed as such. And so I guess I'm wondering, I guess part of what I'm wondering is, it was your kind of call to, careful about this term, but figurative call to arms at the end. Is it that we should just embrace more fully that within this order, these opposition to the kind of industrial imperialism, opposition to the degradation of labor, that is sedition. It's a sedition from this order, and we just need to embrace that and be kind of calling for a redefinition of what the order should be. Like, yes, I am disloyal to this order, but that's not. But I believe in a different possibility for the U.S. and for the
It can be a dangerous thing, but it's, I think it is characteristic of what was happening here. So, one of the leaders of the IWW famously lynched Frank Little in Butte, Montana in August 1970. Had gone there to strike a miners' strike, and I met with the governor, and the governor is telling this or that, and Frank Little basically said to the governor, something like, "I don't give a damn what country your country is fighting. I'm fighting for the freedom of the working class." And I think within 24 hours or so, he was a dead man. But I do think there is that. Now, one thing I wonder about is the degree to which loyalty itself has become a sort of deviant feature in culture today. Because one thing I noticed about the IWW and even the communists in their own way was their deep sense of loyalty to what they were committed to. It's reflected all over. These people were asked, what's your religion? IWW. There was really something there that I don't mean to make too broad a generalization of things now, but I wonder if that in itself is a little bit deviant nowadays. It's utter commitment to something like that in the way that patriots are as well. And I don't mean to, to be too dismissive of that either. That's something quite beautiful. And that too seems to be an object as much of mockery and easily dismissed is anyone who's visited a war memorial or a battlefield memorial can attest that sort of culture of disrespect, that kind of thing, say something about our world has changed. I don't know, I'm kind of rambling a bit away from the point of your question.
I think we would like to thank you again for stimulating talk, and feel free to hang out a little bit.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.